The RMS Queen Mary loomed in the fog, its once grand silhouette now a spectral shadow against the night sky. Captain John Monroe stared up at the colossal ship, a chill crawling down his spine. The ship, docked in Long Beach, had always been shrouded in mystery, but the recent incidents, unexplained deaths, gruesome injuries, and vanishing crew members, had pushed the government to dispatch Monroe's top-secret paranormal investigation team. He had seen his fair share of horrors, but nothing quite like this. "Captain, you seeing this?" Tara Mason, the team's tech expert, murmured beside him. Her voice, usually filled with sarcastic confidence, wavered as she pointed to the ship's upper deck. A figure, draped in tattered clothing, stood motionless, staring down at them. The figure's eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, a silent warning to anyone foolish enough to approach. Monroe squinted, but before he could respond, the figure dissolved into the fog, leaving only an eerie stillness in its wake. "Let's move," Monroe ordered, trying to shake the unsettling feeling. The team boarded the ship, the metal gangplank creaking under their weight. Every step echoed through the empty corridors, amplifying the oppressive silence that clung to the vessel. The team consisted of 4 members: Monroe, Tara, Mike Bulldog Reynolds, a combat specialist with a no-nonsense attitude, and Lily Hartman, an empath whose abilities often placed her at the edge of sanity. Together, they had faced everything from poltergeists to demonic possessions, but the Queen Mary felt different, darker. "Reading anything, Lily?" Monroe asked as they reached the grand ballroom, its once opulent interior now faded and cold. Lily closed her eyes, her breathing shallow. "There's something here, something old and angry. It's like the ship is alive, watching us." "Alive?" Bulldog scoffed, trying to mask his own unease. "It's a damn boat, Hartman." Before Lily could respond, a loud bang echoed through the room. The team spun around, weapons drawn, but the room remained empty. "Stay sharp," Monroe growled. They moved cautiously toward the source of the noise, a large, ornate mirror that hung on the far wall. As they approached, Tara's equipment began to malfunction, the screens flickering erratically. "Tara, what's going on?" Monroe demanded. "Some kind of interference," Tara replied, her voice tight with frustration. "It's like something's scrambling the signals." Lily gasped, clutching her head. "Get away from the mirror," she screamed, but it was too late. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and a grotesque hand shot out, grabbing Bulldog by the throat. The creature emerged fully, its skin gray and mottled, eyes hollow pits of darkness. It pulled Bulldog closer, its other hand digging into his flesh. Blood poured down his neck, staining the pristine white of his uniform. "Get it off me!" Bulldog choked, his eyes bulging in terror. Monroe and Tara opened fire, but the bullets passed through the creature as if it were made of smoke. Desperation clawed at them as they tried to pull Bulldog free, but the creature was too strong. With a sickening crunch, it twisted Bulldog's neck, the sound echoing through the ballroom. The creature released Bulldog's lifeless body, which slumped to the floor. It turned its empty gaze on the remaining team members, a twisted smile forming on its face before it dissolved back into the mirror, leaving only the faint scent of decay behind. Monroe's breath came in ragged gasps as he knelt beside Bulldog's body. The mission had only just begun, and they had already lost one of their own. "Welcome to the Queen Mary," Monroe muttered, a sense of dread settling over him like a shroud. The air aboard the Queen Mary grew thicker, more oppressive, as the team ventured deeper into the ship. Every creak of the wooden floors, every distant clang of metal, sounded like a death knell. Tara's hands shook as she adjusted her equipment, the readings going haywire. The ship was a labyrinth of shadow and silence, each turn promising unseen horrors. "We need to regroup," Monroe said, his voice low. They had retreated to the first-class swimming pool, its once pristine waters now a stagnant, dark abyss. The room reeked of mildew and something far worse, something rotting. "Bulldog's death. I can't get it out of my head," Lily whispered, her face pale. "It's like the ship. It's feeding on our fear." "Then let's starve the bastard," Tara snapped, trying to mask her fear with bravado. But even she couldn't ignore the sensation of being watched, of cold eyes lurking in the shadows just beyond their vision. Monroe glanced around the room, his instincts screaming that they weren't alone. We need to stay focused. Tara, see if you can stabilize the equipment. Lily, keep your senses open, but don't let it overwhelm you. As they worked, the pool area grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. Tara cursed under her breath as her instruments failed one by one, the screens flickering with static. "This place is a damn electromagnetic nightmare," she muttered. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the emergency lights, casting eerie, distorted shadows on the walls. "Monroe!" Lily's voice trembled as she pointed toward the pool. The water, dark and still moments ago, now churned violently, as if something was thrashing just beneath the surface. "Stay back," Monroe ordered, but it was too late. A pale, emaciated hand shot out from the water, gripping the edge of the pool. It was followed by another, and then the figure began to pull itself out. A drowned man, his skin bloated and peeling, eyes wide and lifeless. The team backed away, but the apparition crawled closer, leaving a trail of dark water and bits of decaying flesh in its wake. It opened its mouth to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound escaped. "We need to move now," Monroe barked, but the exits slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. The room grew colder still, their breath visible in the frigid air. The drowned man advanced on them, and as it did, more figures began to rise from the water. Men, women, even children, all with the same hollow eyes and twisted, waterlogged bodies. They moved in unison, their faces contorted in agony. Tara fired her weapon, but the bullets passed through the apparitions like mist, the specters undeterred. They closed in, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. Lily screamed as one of the apparitions reached for her, its icy fingers brushing her skin. "They're all dead, all of them." Monroe grabbed her, pulling her back as the ghosts continued their relentless advance. "There's no way out," Tara gasped, panic seizing her. "We're trapped." Just as the drowned man lunged at them, a loud crack echoed through the room. The emergency lights flickered once more, and suddenly the ghosts vanished, leaving only the sound of dripping water in the now still pool. Monroe's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the empty pool, the silence more terrifying than the screams. What the hell was that? Lily shivered, her teeth chattering. "This ship, it's a graveyard, and we're just the latest bodies to join the collection." The team stood in stunned silence, the realization settling in. They were fighting something far beyond their understanding, and the Queen Mary had only begun to reveal its true horrors. The suffocating darkness of the Queen Mary wrapped around the team like a shroud as they left the pool area, the recent encounter with the drowned spirits weighing heavily on their minds. Every step they took felt like they were walking deeper into the jaws of a monstrous beast. The ship groaned and creaked, as though it were alive and breathing. Monroe led the team down a narrow corridor lined with rusted pipes and peeling paint. The flickering emergency lights cast unsettling shadows that danced and twisted on the walls. Every so often, the echoes of disembodied whispers floated through the corridor, growing louder with each step. "Stay close," Monroe instructed, his voice a low growl. The atmosphere was oppressive, the air thick with the scent of decay and something metallic, like blood. Tara's equipment was still malfunctioning, the screens flashing erratically as they tried to pick up any traces of the entities they had encountered. Lily was visibly trembling, her eyes darting around as if expecting the walls themselves to come alive. "They're talking to us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The spirits, they're angry. They don't want us here." "What are they saying?" Monroe asked, his grip tightening on his weapon. Lily's face twisted in pain as she concentrated, trying to make sense of the cacophony of voices assaulting her mind. "They're warning us, telling us to leave before it's too late. But there's something else, something older, darker." Suddenly, the corridor erupted with noise, an ear-splitting cacophony of voices, wails, and screams that made the walls tremble. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into total darkness. "Shit, not again," Tara cursed, fumbling with her equipment in the dark. But the devices were useless, overwhelmed by the supernatural energy coursing through the ship. Monroe grabbed his flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the darkness. "Stay focused. We have to keep moving." But as the light swept over the corridor, it revealed something that made Monroe's blood run cold. The walls, once rusted and decrepit, were now slick with fresh blood, dripping down in thick, oozing streams. The faces of the dead, contorted in agony, pressed against the blood-soaked walls, their mouths open in silent screams. "Jesus Christ!" Tara breathed, her voice shaking. The walls began to pulse as if the ship itself had a heartbeat, the blood seeping onto the floor, pooling around their feet. The faces of the dead twisted and shifted, their eyes following the team with an unnatural intensity. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the wall, grabbing Monroe's arm with a vice-like grip. He yanked back, but the hand held fast, pulling him closer to the blood-drenched wall. "Monroe!" Lily screamed, reaching out to help him. Tara fired her weapon at the hand, but the bullets passed through it, embedding themselves into the wall with no effect. The hand tightened its grip, pulling Monroe toward the writhing faces. In a last-ditch effort, Monroe drew his combat knife and slashed at the hand, severing it from the wall. Blood sprayed as the hand released him, dropping to the floor where it dissolved into a puddle of black sludge. Panting, Monroe stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to get the hell out of here," he gasped, wiping the blood from his face. But the corridor had other plans. The walls began to close in on them, the blood-soaked metal creaking and groaning as it moved. The faces of the dead continued to scream silently, their agony filling the air with a suffocating pressure. "Run!" Monroe barked, leading the charge down the narrowing corridor. They sprinted through the darkness, the walls closing in behind them like a vice. The sound of the dead echoed in their ears, a relentless reminder of the horrors that lurked within the Queen Mary. Just as it seemed the walls would crush them, they burst through a door at the end of the corridor, stumbling into the ship's engine room. The door slammed shut behind them, the echoes of the damned finally silenced. But the engine room offered no relief. The massive machinery, once the heart of the ship, was now a rusted, decaying nightmare. The air was thick with the stench of oil, metal, and death. The floor was slick with black sludge, and the walls were covered in deep claw marks, as though something monstrous had tried to tear its way out. "Where the hell are we?" Tara muttered, her voice laced with fear. Monroe scanned the room, his flashlight cutting through the thick shadows. "The engine room," he replied, his voice grim. "But it's not like any engine room I've ever seen." Lily shivered, her eyes wide with terror. "We're not alone here." Monroe tightened his grip on his weapon, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But there was no turning back now. They were in the heart of the Queen Mary, and whatever evil had taken hold of the ship was only getting stronger. The engine room was a labyrinth of rusted pipes, decaying machinery, and impenetrable darkness. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to grow thicker with every breath they took. Monroe led the team deeper into the belly of the beast, his senses on high alert. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. Tara's equipment, still on the fritz, crackled to life for a brief moment, the readings spiking wildly before the screens went dark again. "We're picking up something, but it's not normal. It's like the ship's energy is feeding on itself," she said, her voice tinged with dread. "We need to find a way out of here," Monroe replied, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The walls around them seemed to close in, the metallic groan of the ship echoing like the growl of a beast ready to strike. Suddenly, a sound cut through the darkness, a skittering, scratching noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The team froze, their eyes darting around the room. "Did you hear that?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah, and it's getting closer," Tara muttered, raising her weapon. Monroe signaled for them to stay quiet as he slowly moved the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. The light caught movement, something crawling along the walls, quick and spider-like. "Contact!" Monroe barked, aiming his weapon at the creature. But before he could fire, the crawler leapt from the wall, its grotesque, elongated limbs reaching out for him. The team opened fire, bullets tearing through the air, but the creature was fast, too fast. It darted between the shadows, its body a twisted amalgamation of human and something far more monstrous. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. Its eyes were sunken, glowing with a malevolent light, and its mouth was filled with rows of needle-like teeth. Tara screamed as one of the crawlers lunged at her, knocking her to the ground. She fought back, slashing with her knife, but the creature's strength was overwhelming. It pinned her down, its teeth inches from her throat. Monroe fired at the crawler, the bullet striking it in the side. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that echoed through the engine room. It recoiled, giving Tara just enough time to roll out from under it and scramble to her feet. "Keep moving," Monroe shouted as more crawlers emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing in the dark. The team backed away, firing at anything that moved, but the creatures were relentless. As they retreated deeper into the engine room, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The sound of metal groaning under immense pressure filled the air, followed by the sickening crack of something massive breaking free. "We need to get out of here now," Monroe yelled, grabbing Lily's arm and pulling her along as the crawlers closed in around them. But the ship wasn't done with them yet. The floor suddenly gave way, a gaping hole opening beneath their feet. Monroe and Tara barely managed to grab onto a nearby pipe as the others tumbled into the darkness below. "Lily! Bulldog!" Tara screamed, her voice raw with terror as she tried to hold on. But the hole wasn't just a fall into darkness. From the abyss below, something far worse than the crawlers emerged. A massive, shadowy figure with eyes that burned like embers in a dying fire. Its presence sucked the warmth from the air, freezing the very breath in their lungs. The creature, a shadowman, rose from the darkness, its form shifting and writhing as it towered over them. Its eyes locked onto Monroe, and in that moment, he felt pure, unadulterated fear. The shadowman let out a roar that shook the entire ship, the sound reverberating through the metal walls like a death knell. The crawlers scattered, retreating into the darkness, but the shadowman moved with purpose, its gaze fixed on the survivors. Monroe knew they were out of time. The Queen Mary was no longer just a haunted ship. It was a prison, and they were its prey. "Go! Get out of here!" Monroe shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of the ship's death throes. But there was no escape. The shadowman lunged at them, its massive hand reaching out to drag. The world spun as Monroe and Tara clung to the rusted pipe, dangling above the gaping maw that had opened beneath their feet. Below them, Bulldog and Lily had disappeared into the darkness, swallowed whole by the abyss. The sound of the shadowman's roar still echoed in their ears, a reminder that the horrors were far from over. The ship groaned as if alive, the metal walls closing in as the shadowman loomed closer. Its form was an ever-shifting mass of darkness, its eyes glowing like dying embers, watching them with a predatory hunger. The air around it grew colder, the temperature plummeting to a bone-chilling degree. Frost began to form on the metal, creeping up the walls and along the pipe that was their only lifeline. "We need to move now," Monroe grunted, trying to pull himself up, but the frost was making the pipe slippery, his grip weakening with every second. Tara, still clutching her weapon, struggled to swing her legs up, using her upper body strength to hook her foot onto the edge of the opening. With a grunt of effort, she managed to pull herself onto solid ground, quickly reaching down to help Monroe. "Hurry," Tara urged, her eyes wide with fear as the shadowman reached out, its dark tendrils inching closer. Monroe's muscles screamed in protest as he forced himself up, grabbing Tara's outstretched hand just as the pipe beneath him snapped with a loud crack. He tumbled forward, collapsing onto the floor next to her as the pipe fell into the void below, clattering against unseen metal far below. They both lay there, gasping for breath, as the shadowman's tendrils brushed against the edge of the hole. Tara raised her weapon, ready to fire, but Monroe stopped her, his eyes fixed on the creature. "Save your ammo," he panted, pulling her back. "We need to find Bulldog and Lily. They could still be alive." Tara nodded, though the fear in her eyes told him she wasn't so sure. The shadowman let out another roar, its tendrils withdrawing as it seemed to retreat back into the abyss, leaving them in an uneasy silence. Monroe quickly scanned the room, searching for any sign of an exit. The ship's layout was a twisted labyrinth, constantly shifting as if it were alive, trying to trap them in its bowels. The engine room was no longer recognizable, the machinery twisted and distorted, covered in frost and rust. There! Monroe pointed to a narrow passageway that had appeared on the other side of the room, the metal walls slick with frost. We need to move, before that thing comes back. Tara didn't argue, following him as they carefully made their way across the room. The floor beneath their feet felt unsteady, the metal creaking with every step as if it could give way at any moment. The air was thick with the scent of rust and decay, the oppressive atmosphere weighing down on them like a heavy shroud. They entered the passageway, the walls narrowing around them, forcing them to move single file. The shadows seemed to cling to them, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Monroe kept his flashlight aimed ahead, the narrow beam cutting through the gloom, but it did little to ease the tension coiling in his gut. "Do you think they're still alive?" Tara asked, her voice a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would draw the creatures back to them. Monroe didn't answer immediately, his mind racing with possibilities. The ship was a death trap, filled with more than just restless spirits. The things they'd seen, the crawlers, the shadowman, were something far darker, more malevolent than any ghost story he'd ever encountered. "We have to believe they are," Monroe finally said, his voice firm. "We're not leaving anyone behind." As they pushed further into the passageway, the sound of footsteps echoed from up ahead. Monroe tensed, raising his weapon, but what emerged from the shadows made his blood run cold. Bulldog stumbled into view, his face a mask of terror, blood streaming down his forehead. His clothes were torn, and deep gashes marred his arms, as if something had clawed at him in the dark. "Bulldog!" Tara rushed forward, catching him as he nearly collapsed. "They're coming!" Bulldog gasped, his voice hoarse and panicked. "They're right behind me. We have to go now." Before Monroe could ask what had happened, a sound unlike anything they'd heard before reverberated through the passageway, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down his spine. The shadows behind Bulldog shifted, revealing the glint of something sharp, claws or teeth, he couldn't tell. "Run!" Monroe shouted, grabbing Tara's arm as they sprinted down the passageway, the growls growing louder, closer. They didn't dare look back, knowing that whatever was chasing them would not stop until it had claimed its prey. The passageway twisted and turned, a narrow artery within the Queen Mary's labyrinthine bowels. Monroe, Tara, and the wounded Bulldog ran with everything they had, the sounds of their pursuers growing closer with each passing second. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the walls seemed to close in, narrowing until they were forced to move single file through the tight, winding space. "We need to find a defensible position," Monroe barked, his voice carrying over the cacophony of growls and the pounding of their footsteps. Bulldog stumbled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. There's a chapel ahead," he managed to choke out. "I saw it before they came for me." Monroe's mind raced. A chapel? On a ship like this? It didn't make sense, but nothing about the Queen Mary had made sense since they'd boarded. "Lead the way," he ordered, hoping the space would offer some semblance of safety. The passageway finally opened up into a large, dark chamber. The ceiling arched high above, and the walls were lined with cracked and faded murals, images of angels and saints, their faces twisted and decayed. At the far end of the room stood an altar, draped in tattered cloth, a massive crucifix hanging on the wall behind it. The place was a grotesque parody of a sacred space, tainted by the malevolent energy that pulsed through the ship. "This is it," Bulldog panted, his voice tinged with despair. Monroe scanned the room, searching for anything they could use to barricade the entrance. But there was nothing, just empty pews rotting and crumbling, and the overwhelming sense of dread that permeated the air. "They're coming," Tara warned, her eyes wide with fear as she aimed her weapon at the passageway they had just exited. Monroe rushed to the altar, grabbing the massive, rusted candelabra that sat upon it. With a grunt of effort, he heaved it to the ground, the sound echoing like a death knell through the chapel. He dragged it to the entrance, wedging it against the doorway in a feeble attempt to slow their pursuers. No sooner had he stepped back than the first of the creatures burst into the room. A crawler, its twisted limbs propelling it forward at an alarming speed. Tara fired, the bullets tearing through the creature's body, but it barely slowed down, its glowing eyes locked onto them with a murderous hunger. "Take it down!" Monroe shouted, firing his own weapon at the crawler, but it was like shooting at a nightmare. The creature's body absorbed the bullets, black ichor oozing from the wounds, but it didn't stop. It lunged at them, its mouth opening wide to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. Bulldog swung his knife at the crawler, the blade sinking deep into its neck. The creature let out a high-pitched screech, a sound that made their blood run cold, before it collapsed to the ground, twitching violently as it bled out. But there was no time to celebrate. More crawlers flooded into the room, their eyes glowing in the dim light of the chapel. And behind them, the shadowman loomed, its massive form filling the passageway, blocking any hope of escape. "We can't hold them off," Tara screamed, her voice desperate as she fired into the horde of creatures. Monroe's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, but every option seemed hopeless. The shadowman advanced, its tendrils snaking through the air, reaching for them. The crawlers were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Just as the shadowman stepped into the chapel, its dark form casting a suffocating shadow over them, the crucifix behind the altar suddenly began to glow. A blinding light erupted from it, flooding the room with a brilliant, searing brightness. The creatures recoiled, their shrieks filling the air as the light burned through them, turning them to ash. Monroe shielded his eyes from the light, his heart pounding in his chest. The shadowman let out a roar of rage, its form disintegrating in the holy light. The crawlers writhed and twisted, their bodies crumbling to dust as the light consumed them. When the light finally faded, the chapel was silent. The creatures were gone, reduced to nothing but ash and echoes. Monroe, Tara, and Bulldog stood in stunned silence, the realization of their narrow escape sinking in. But they knew this was far from over. The Queen Mary was a place of unspeakable evil, and they had only just begun to uncover its horrors. The eerie silence that settled over the chapel was suffocating, heavy with the weight of the horrors they had just witnessed. Monroe, Tara, and Bulldog stood amidst the ashes of the crawlers, their breaths ragged and eyes wide with disbelief. The crucifix that had blazed with holy light was now dark and cold, as though the power it had wielded had been exhausted. But there was no time to rest. The Queen Mary was not done with them, and they all knew it. "We need to keep moving," Monroe said, his voice barely more than a whisper in the oppressive silence. He looked to Bulldog, who was leaning heavily against a crumbling pew, his face pale and sweat-slicked. The gashes on his arms and forehead were deep, and blood still seeped from the wounds. "Can you keep going?" Bulldog nodded weakly, though it was clear he was running on fumes. Tara moved to his side, offering what support she could. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, her voice trembling with the aftermath of terror. The chapel, for all its momentary protection, felt like a dead end, a place where they could be cornered and slaughtered if they stayed too long. Monroe glanced around the chapel, his eyes landing on a door hidden in the shadows behind the altar. It was small, almost unnoticeable, as if the ship itself had tried to keep it a secret. "There," he said, pointing. "That door might lead us deeper into the ship. It's risky, but staying here isn't an option." With a nod, Tara helped Bulldog to his feet, and they cautiously approached the door. Monroe pushed it open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Beyond the threshold, a narrow staircase descended into darkness, the air wafting up from below cold and stale. "Watch your step," Monroe warned as they began their descent, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the tight space. The walls were close, almost suffocating, and the deeper they went, the more the darkness seemed to press in on them, as if it were a living entity eager to consume them. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a long corridor, its walls lined with old, cracked tiles that glistened with moisture. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something foul like rotting flesh. A shuffling noise echoed through the corridor, the sound too faint to pinpoint its source. Monroe motioned for silence, his flashlight cutting through the dark as he led the way forward. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows at the edges of the light dancing and shifting as if they were alive. Suddenly, a low moan filled the air, followed by a series of faint whispers, voices speaking in a language none of them could understand. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, wrapping around them like a cold, invisible hand. Tara's breath hitched as she gripped Bulldog's arm tighter. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Monroe nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Stay close," he whispered back, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the ship's very walls were speaking to them, urging them to turn back, to abandon hope. But there was no turning back. They pressed on, the whispers growing into a cacophony of voices, overlapping and discordant. The walls of the corridor seemed to pulse with life, the tiles warping and bulging as though something beneath them was trying to break free. Without warning, the ground beneath their feet shifted, the tiles cracking and splintering as dark, slimy tendrils burst through, reaching for them. Monroe shouted a warning, but it was too late. The tendrils wrapped around Bulldog's leg, yanking him off his feet. Tara screamed as she tried to pull Bulldog free, but the tendrils were too strong, dragging him toward the gaping cracks in the floor. Monroe fired his weapon at the tendrils, the bullets ripping through the slimy appendages, but they kept coming, more and more of them emerging from the darkness. "Help me!" Bulldog cried out, his voice filled with terror as he was pulled closer to the dark abyss that had opened beneath him. His fingers clawed at the tiles, trying to find purchase, but it was no use. The tendrils were relentless, pulling him down, inch by inch. Monroe grabbed Bulldog's arms, straining with all his might to pull him back, but the tendrils were too powerful. With one final, desperate pull, the tendrils yanked Bulldog into the darkness. His scream cut short as the ground sealed itself shut, leaving nothing but cracked, blood-stained tiles behind. Tara collapsed to her knees, her sobs echoing through the corridor. "No, no, Bulldog," she whispered, her voice broken. Monroe stood in stunned silence, his heart heavy with guilt and rage. He wanted to scream, to lash out at the ship and the evil that had claimed yet another of their team, but he knew it would be futile. "We have to keep moving," Monroe said, his voice hollow. He didn't believe his own words, but there was no other choice. They were trapped in the belly of the beast, and the only way out was forward. With tears streaming down her face, Tara nodded and rose to her feet. Together, they continued down the corridor, the whispers now fading into an eerie, oppressive silence. Monroe and Tara pressed on through the winding corridors of the Queen Mary, their senses heightened and nerves frayed to the breaking point. Every step echoed in the unnatural silence, a reminder that they were utterly alone, trapped in a floating tomb with an evil that defied comprehension. The ship seemed to have a will of its own, guiding them deeper into its haunted bowels, away from any hope of escape. Tara's tears had dried, leaving her eyes red and swollen, but she marched forward with grim determination. Monroe could see the fear etched into her face, but he also saw the steely resolve that kept her moving. They had lost Bulldog to the darkness, but they couldn't afford to lose themselves. Not yet. As they turned another corner, they were met with a set of double doors at the end of the corridor. The doors were massive, made of heavy steel, and streaked with rust and something else, something dark. Dried blood stained the handles, smeared across the metal like the remnants of some violent struggle. "We don't have a choice," Monroe muttered, steeling himself as he reached for the handle. With a deep breath, he pushed the doors open, and they swung inward with a loud creak. What lay beyond was a nightmare made flesh. The room was massive, the walls lined with what looked like surgical tables, each one covered in dark, sticky blood. The air was thick with the metallic scent of fresh gore, and the floor was slick with it, as though something or someone had been slaughtered here repeatedly. Overhead, flickering lights cast sickly shadows, making the room seem alive with writhing shapes. In the center of the room, a massive pit yawned open, its edges slick with more blood. It seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if the ship's malevolence was concentrated here, in this horrifying epicenter. Above the pit, hanging from rusty chains, were bodies, or what was left of them. They were mutilated beyond recognition, their limbs twisted at impossible angles, their faces frozen in expressions of unspeakable horror. Tara gagged, turning away as she fought to keep from vomiting. What the hell is this place?" she gasped, her voice shaking. Monroe didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the pit, a deep, primal fear gnawing at his insides. The room was alive with the energy of countless tormented souls, their agony seeping into the very walls. He could feel their despair, their hopelessness, like a suffocating blanket wrapping around his heart. As they stepped further into the room, the lights flickered again, plunging them into brief darkness before returning with a sickly glow. In that brief moment, Monroe felt something brush against his leg, something wet and warm. He jumped back, his heart racing as he aimed his flashlight at the floor. A pool of blood was spreading rapidly across the room, flowing from the pit like a river of crimson. It moved with unnatural speed, as if drawn to them, seeking to engulf them in its horrific embrace. "We need to get out of here," Tara cried, backing away as the blood continued to spread, creeping toward them like a living entity. But as they turned to flee, the double doors slammed shut with a deafening crash, sealing them inside. The blood reached the walls, climbing upward like a tide, filling the room with the sound of gurgling, bubbling fluid. The smell was overpowering, sickeningly sweet and metallic, like the scent of death itself. Monroe's mind raced, searching for a way out, but the room offered no escape. The walls were closing in, the blood rising higher, now reaching their ankles, then their knees. It was thick and viscous, clinging to their clothes and skin, dragging them down with every step. Suddenly, a low, guttural voice filled the room, reverberating through the walls. It was a voice of pure malice, ancient and filled with a hatred that transcended time. "Leave this place, or join them in eternal torment," the voice growled, its words echoing through. The blood continued to rise, sloshing against Monroe and Tara's waists, its dark warmth pressing in from all sides. The voice had faded into a menacing silence, leaving them alone with the horrifying realization that they were trapped. The room, now fully transformed into a grotesque, blood-filled crypt, seemed intent on swallowing them whole. "Monroe, we need to find a way out, anything." Tara's voice trembled with panic, her wide eyes darting around the room as she struggled to maintain her footing in the thick, syrupy fluid. Monroe's mind raced as he scanned the walls, now slick with blood and pulsing as if alive. The lights above flickered violently, casting disturbing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe in the dark liquid. Every surface felt oppressive, like the ship itself was alive, breathing, watching, waiting to crush them under its weight. In the far corner, Monroe spotted a rusty grate partially submerged in the blood. "There, that might be our way out," he pointed, grabbing Tara's arm as they began to wade through the viscous fluid, each step more difficult than the last. The blood seemed to resist them, thickening and pulling at their legs as though it were sentient, intent on dragging them down into its depths. The bodies hanging above them swayed, their chains creaking ominously as they moved, making the room feel even more suffocating. It was as if the very walls were closing in. They finally reached the grate, which was crusted over with rust and grime. Monroe dropped to his knees, his hands slipping on the wet, slimy surface as he pried at the metal with all his strength. The blood was up to their chests now, and Tara had to tilt her head back to keep her face above the rising flood. "Come on, come on." Monroe gritted his teeth, feeling the weight of the blood press harder against him. The metal groaned in protest, but it refused to budge. Tara, panicking, slammed her fists against the grate, her voice rising in desperation. "It's not moving. Monroe, it's not." Suddenly, the lights above them burst, plunging the room into pitch darkness. Tara screamed, her voice echoing off the walls as something cold and sharp grazed her leg beneath the blood. Monroe's breath caught in his throat as he felt something slither around his ankle, tugging with a force that nearly knocked him off balance. "Hold on!" Monroe shouted, blindly reaching for Tara in the darkness. His fingers found hers, and he gripped her hand tightly, pulling her close as the blood surged around them. They could hear the movement beneath the surface, the sound of something large and serpentine twisting through the thick liquid, circling them, ready to strike. "We're not dying here," Monroe yelled, using every ounce of strength to pry the grate loose. The metal finally gave way with a screech, the grate falling into the blood with a splash. Without hesitation, Monroe shoved Tara into the opening, following close behind as the blood surged over their heads. They plunged into a narrow tunnel, the blood-filled crypt above now a distant nightmare as they slid down through the darkness, carried by the blood's relentless current. The tunnel twisted and turned, the blood pressing in on all sides, forcing them deeper into the bowels of the ship. It was impossible to breathe, the thick liquid filling their mouths and noses, choking the air from their lungs. Monroe's world was a blur of red and darkness, the sensation of drowning overwhelming his senses. Just when he thought they would be lost forever in the endless flow, the tunnel suddenly dropped, spitting them out into a new chamber. They crashed onto cold, wet stone, gasping for air as the blood drained away through unseen cracks in the floor. Monroe coughed violently, his lungs burning as he tried to catch his breath. Tara lay beside him, shivering uncontrollably, her face pale and streaked with blood. They were in a cavernous room, dimly lit by a sickly green glow that emanated from cracks in the walls. The air was damp and cold, carrying the stench of decay and rot. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, its surface covered in ancient symbols carved deep into the rock. The altar was surrounded by flickering shadows that seemed to dance and twist of their own accord, moving in time with the strange energy that pulsed through the air. Monroe pushed himself to his feet, his entire body trembling from the ordeal. "We made it, but where the hell are we now?" Tara slowly sat up, her eyes wide with fear as she took in their new surroundings. This place, it feels even worse than before. We're deeper in the heart of it, Monroe. We're not safe here. Monroe knew she was right. This was no sanctuary. It was a tomb, an ancient, forgotten place, steeped in a malevolent history that clung to the very walls. The altar in the center of the room radiated a dark power, drawing them in, pulling them closer as if demanding their submission. "We have to move, Tara," Monroe whispered, his voice hoarse. "We can't stay here. Whatever this place is, it's not going to let us leave easily." With a shared look of dread, they began to circle the altar, searching for any sign of an exit. But as they approached the stone, the shadows around it surged forward, rising from the floor like living smoke, coiling and twisting into nightmarish shapes that reached out for them with claws made of darkness. The shadows lunged toward them with a ferocity that took Monroe and Tara by surprise. The tendrils of darkness wrapped around their limbs, cold as death, pulling them toward the stone altar in the center of the room. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in, the oppressive energy thickening, making it hard to breathe. Tara struggled against the shadows, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tried to break free. "Monroe, help me!" she cried, her voice filled with terror as the shadows pulled her closer to the altar, the ancient symbols glowing with a sickly green light. Monroe, too, was ensnared, his arms pinned to his sides as the darkness tightened its grip. He could feel the malevolent intent of the shadows, their desire to drag them down into the abyss, to offer them up as sacrifices to whatever ancient evil dwelled within the ship. Desperation fueled Monroe's movements. He strained against the darkness, gritting his teeth as he fought with every ounce of strength he had left. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the shadows draining his life force as they held him in place. But he couldn't give in. He had to fight for himself, for Tara, for the slim hope that they could survive this nightmare. With a surge of adrenaline, Monroe managed to free one arm, his hand reaching for the knife strapped to his belt. He slashed at the shadows, the blade cutting through the darkness with a hissing sound, like steam escaping from a pressure valve. The shadows recoiled, retreating just enough for Monroe to break free. He stumbled forward, grabbing Tara's hand and pulling her away from the altar. "We have to go," Monroe shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The shadows writhed and twisted, reforming as they prepared to strike again. But Monroe wasn't about to let them. He yanked Tara toward the far side of the chamber, where he had spotted a narrow passage hidden in the shadows. They sprinted for the passage, the shadows closing in behind them like a wave of darkness. The air grew colder with each step, their breath visible in the freezing air. The walls of the passage were rough and uneven, the stone cold and damp under their hands as they scrambled through the tight space. The passage narrowed further, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees. The darkness was absolute, swallowing the faint glow from the chamber behind them. The sounds of the shadows' pursuit faded, but the oppressive presence lingered, making it clear that they were far from safe. At last, the passage opened into a small, circular chamber. The walls were lined with old, decayed wood, and the ceiling was low, barely allowing them to stand upright. In the center of the room was a large, iron-bound chest, its surface covered in the same ancient symbols that adorned the altar. Monroe approached the chest cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "What do you think is inside?" he asked, his voice low and wary. Tara shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's part of this ship's curse. We shouldn't open it, Monroe. We should just leave it alone." But Monroe knew they couldn't leave it alone. This chest, whatever it held, was tied to the evil that permeated the Queen Mary. He could feel it, a dark energy radiating from within, like a heartbeat pulsing in the dead air. If they were ever to escape this nightmare, they needed to understand it. They needed to face whatever was inside. With a deep breath, Monroe knelt in front of the chest and grasped the iron handles. The metal was cold to the touch, sending a shiver down his spine. He hesitated for a moment, then, with a determined nod, he pulled the chest open. A gust of freezing air blasted from within, carrying the scent of ancient decay. Inside the chest lay a book, its cover made of old, cracked leather, bound with iron clasps. The pages were yellowed with age, and the symbols on the cover were unlike any Monroe had ever seen, alien and disturbing, etched deep into the hide. Monroe reached for the book, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the rough surface. As soon as he touched it, a shock of cold shot through his body, and the chamber was filled with a low, droning hum, a sound that resonated in the very marrow of his bones. Tara took a step back, her face pale with fear. "Monroe, what have you done?" The book's cover creaked as Monroe lifted it, revealing pages filled with dark, scrawling text and detailed illustrations of rituals, sacrifices, and summoning circles. The words seemed to writhe on the page, moving and shifting like living things, making Monroe's head spin as he tried to focus. And then, from the darkness beyond the passage, the shadows began to stir again, drawn by the book's power. Monroe could feel their presence growing stronger, more determined, more hungry. "We have to go now." Monroe slammed the book shut and shoved it into his backpack. The droning hum intensified, the walls of the chamber vibrating with the dark energy that now surrounded them. The ship itself seemed to groan in response, the ancient evil within awakening to the disturbance. Monroe grabbed Tara's hand, pulling her toward the passage they had come through, but the way was blocked. The shadows were there, coalescing into a solid mass that barred their escape, their malevolent eyes glowing with a sickly light. They were trapped, and this time there was no escape. The shadows thickened, filling the passage with a pulsating darkness that seemed to swallow all light. Monroe and Tara backed away, their hearts pounding in their chests as the malevolent mass loomed before them, cutting off any hope of escape. The air grew colder still, and the droning hum from the book in Monroe's backpack grew louder, vibrating through the walls of the chamber, as if calling out to the darkness itself. Monroe gripped the knife in his hand, his knuckles white. "We can't stay here, Tara. We need to find another way out. There has to be something." Before he could finish, the shadows surged forward, their forms coiling and twisting into grotesque shapes, faces with hollow eyes, gaping mouths, and elongated limbs that reached out to them. The temperature plummeted, and their breath crystallized in the frigid air. The ship groaned around them, the ancient wood creaking as the dark energy pulsed through it. The walls began to close in, warping and twisting as if the very structure of the ship was alive, trying to consume them. Monroe and Tara stumbled back, their eyes wide with terror as the shadows advanced. The book in Monroe's backpack throbbed with a dark pulse, and he could feel the weight of its power, tugging at him, urging him to open it again. "No!" Monroe shouted, refusing to give in to the pull. He slashed at the shadows with his knife, but the blade passed through them as if they were smoke. The shadows only laughed, a chilling, echoing sound that reverberated through the chamber. Tara, her back pressed against the cold stone wall, looked at Monroe with desperation in her eyes. "We're not getting out of this, are we? Monroe, I don't want to die here." Monroe's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but the shadows were relentless. He knew they couldn't fight them, not with the weapons they had. The only chance they had was to break the curse, to sever the connection that had bound these dark entities to the Queen Mary for so long. But how? The book. The thought struck him like a lightning bolt. The book was the key, the source of the curse, the artifact that had awakened the darkness. It had to be destroyed. Monroe yanked the backpack from his shoulders and tore it open, pulling out the ancient tome. The leather-bound book felt heavier now, as if it had absorbed the very darkness that surrounded them. The symbols on the cover glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the ship's groans. Tara watched him, her face a mask of fear and confusion. "What are you doing?" Monroe didn't answer. He knew there wasn't time. He flipped open the book, the pages fluttering as if caught in a fierce wind, though the air in the chamber was deathly still. The words on the pages writhed, the ink seeming to bleed as the text shifted and twisted before his eyes. Monroe held the book over the flickering shadows, his hand trembling. He knew what he had to do, but the darkness inside the book fought against him, resisting his every move. With a final desperate yell, Monroe hurled the book into the shadows. The tome hit the ground with a dull thud, and for a moment everything was still. Then the shadows shrieked, a piercing wail that echoed through the ship. The book's cover began to smolder, the ancient leather charring and blackening as the pages within caught fire. The flames were not normal. They burned with a cold blue light, spreading rapidly through the book as the shadows recoiled, retreating from the light. Monroe and Tara watched in stunned silence as the book was consumed by the unnatural fire. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms unraveling as the flames grew brighter, devouring the darkness that had surrounded them. The ship trembled violently, the walls shaking as the energy that had held the curse began to unravel. The chamber around them started to collapse, the wood splintering and the stone walls cracking as the very fabric of the Queen Mary began to tear apart. "We have to go," Monroe shouted, grabbing Tara's hand. The passage that had been blocked by the shadows was now clear, the darkness dissipating as the flames continued to burn. They ran, the ship groaning and collapsing around them, the sound of splintering wood and shattering stone filling the air. They reached the upper decks, the once grand ship now a crumbling ruin. The corridors were filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning, but the shadows were gone, their presence banished by the destruction of the book. As they burst out onto the deck, the cold night air hit them, bringing with it the salty scent of the ocean. The Queen Mary was sinking, the bow already submerged as the ship slowly tilted forward. The water lapped at the deck, icy cold and dark as ink. Monroe and Tara didn't stop. They ran to the edge of the deck and jumped into the freezing water below, the shock of the cold stealing the breath from their lungs. They swam away from the sinking ship, their limbs numb, driven by sheer adrenaline and the desperate will to survive. Behind them, the Queen Mary groaned one last time, the sound echoing across the water as the ship finally sank beneath the waves, taking its cursed history with it. Monroe and Tara floated in the cold, dark water, their breath ragged, their bodies exhausted. But they were alive. The nightmare was over. As dawn broke on the horizon, the first rays of sunlight touched the surface of the ocean, casting a warm glow over the water. Monroe looked at Tara, his eyes filled with relief and disbelief. They had survived the abyss. They had escaped the darkness. But as they drifted in the calm waters, the realization dawned on them both. The Queen Mary was gone, but the darkness that had claimed so many lives over the years would never truly disappear. It would find another place, another time, another way to reach out from the abyss and claim the souls of those who dared to challenge it. For now, though, they were safe, and that was enough.